Hey y'all, welcome back to another Vue video, and this week I want to show you guys how to deploy your Vue project to a real website with a real URL that you can customize. And this whole process is super easy, super quick, and free using the tools that I'm going to be using today. And by the end of this video, you'll know how to deploy your project with just a single command, so it will be super easy to integrate into your workflow. You can just make your changes, add and commit changes, and then run this deployment script, and everything should be updated onto your website. And so, without further ado, let's get right into it. So before we get started, let's just do a quick overview of the tools that we're going to be using today. And so first of all, of course, we have Vue, and that's the front-end framework that we're programming in. And Vue is going to give us the functionality of building our Vue files into HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. This part's super important because these are the only types of files that a web browser is able to interpret and render into a website. A web browser would not know how to interpret a Vue file, and the syntax is very different. So Vue is going to be responsible for turning our very easy to read Vue files into maybe more complicated HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Then we're going to take those files and put them onto a GitHub repository. I already have one set up where you can find a lot of the code for my videos. But we're going to use a specific feature of GitHub called GitHub Pages. And so basically what GitHub Pages does is that GitHub will provide us with this unique URL based on our username and repository name. And so when someone goes to access this URL, it will serve some of the files from our GitHub repository, specifically these HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. And so what this means for us as developers is that it provides a really easy and free way for us to distribute our website to others on the internet. And we don't have to worry about any separate service for hosting it. We can do it all through GitHub. Okay, so now that we've kind of gotten familiar with the tools, let's talk about the changes we actually need to make. In total, there's going to be 2 new files that we need to create and just a minor modification to our Gitignore file. So first, this new file is called the Vue.config.js. Just going to add it at the root of our project. And what we want to put in here is we're just modifying really one property of our Vue project. And specifically, it's called public path. So public path, it really just tells Vue where to go to look for, JS, CSS, and image files, so like all our static files. And by default, it's going to look for these files at the root URL. So what I mean by root URL is it's basically just the base URL and then a /, nothing after that, right? So for example, www.github.com/ or www.google.com/, nothing after that. However, when we deploy to GitHub Pages, our default URL is going to follow this pattern where there's a / repository and then our repository name /. So if our Vue project looks for our JavaScript and CSS files at just the /, it's not going to find them there. It has to go / our repository name and then /. And that's why here I'm going to set our public path if we're building for production, which is what will happen when we run our build command. We want to set public path to / and then my Git repository name. One important note is that you probably won't need to do this if you're deploying to a custom URL, because you will probably just be putting your website at, www.yourcustomurl.com, no other thing after the /. This is just really if you're deploying to the GitHub Pages URL. Next, we have our deployment script. And what this is just a bash script that we can run in the command line, and it just runs a bunch of commands for us that we might otherwise have to type out manually. And so this is the biggest part of this change, and it can be a little bit confusing, but let's try to walk through it together. So first of all, we have our npm run build command, and this is a built-in command that is provided when you create a new Vue project. So this build command, what it does is it takes our Vue files and turns them into, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and it will put them by default under this folder called dist, which I think stands for distribution. And as you can see, we have, as promised, CSS, JavaScript, and an index.html. And a lot of this is kind of compressed and nonsensical to us, but the browser can understand. And so now that we've built our web files, all of this remaining part of the script is really trying to push our files from our local computer to the GitHub branch that we'll use to deploy our GitHub Pages site. And so these 2 lines are really optional. All they do is save the latest commit hash as a string so that when we deploy, we'll be able to see which commit we're deploying. And this is just very helpful to keep track of, which version of your code is actually being shown on your deployed website. And so after that, we're going to navigate into that distribution folder that I talked about earlier. And here's another optional step if you're deploying to a custom domain that you might need to add this, uncomment this out. And so now finally we get to the main part of this section is we're going to initialize a new Git repository within that folder. This might seem kind of weird considering we were already in a Git repository, but you can think of this as like a sub repository, and it's just kind of a temporary repository that we're going to use. So after we initialize that repository, we're going to add all these files, which are really these files over here on the left. And so we're going to add all those files, commit them. We include that commit hash as part of our commit message. And finally, we're going to push this new repository as a branch under our initial repository. And so let's break this down a little bit. Whenever we create a new repository, it comes with a default branch, right? Those default branches used to be called master, but for good reasons, we're shifting away from that language towards main. But for some reason, when you do git init, now it still defaults to master. What we're doing is we're initializing a new repository. And so we're adding all the folders and files under this distribution folder as a commit on the default branch of this new repository. And then we want to push this branch, which is the current master branch of this sub-repository, but we want to push it as a branch to our main repository. This is just a temporary repository that we're using to isolate our deployment files. But once we've added and committed those files, we're going to push it as a branch, which we're calling GitHub Pages, ultimately to my main repository, which is Vue Video Tutorials. And so if none of this made sense to you, I recommend reading through some Git and GitHub concepts first, like branches and repositories. If you still have questions, please feel free to leave it in comment below. I'll try my best to, answer whatever questions. And so the last change we need to make is just adding the dist folder to our Gitignore. We don't want any of these files or folders getting into our code base because these are not files that we change and they're not code related, right? So it just takes up space. And so we just want to ignore them and not add them into our code branch. And so now let's try running this script, and I'll kind of show you what the output is doing and how it corresponds to our script so you can have a better idea of what's going on. So first we're just going to run the script in the command line. As you can see here, it's using the Vue CLI service to build. And so, that happened pretty quickly, but basically it says building for production, right? And so it shows us, what the output files are, how large they are, and it says build complete. Like it says here, this directory is ready to be deployed. And then the next part is where we have all of the Git commands being run. And so you can see first here it says we initialized an empty Git repository in the dist subfolder. We're going to deploy from the master branch of this sub repository. And these are all the files that we are adding and committed. And so you can see it's our CSS files, JS files, and index.html. And at the bottom here, finally, it says it's being pushed to our main repository, Vue Video Tutorials, but it's under the GitHub Pages branch. So now if I actually go to my GitHub repository, we can see that, my default branch is main, and I have a bunch of these other branches, but in particular, we want to look at the GitHub Pages branch, right? And so you can see that in this branch, it doesn't look at all like my other branches because all it has is the CSS, JS, and HTML files, and that's it. So that's why we needed to create that subrepository so that we would only capture these files that we've built in the dist folder. We don't want any of the other files because this is all we need to serve our website, right? If we go back to the main branch, we can see all our code, but when we deploy it to GitHub Pages, it's just our web files. And so the final step here is to really set up our GitHub Pages. So to do that, we need to go into settings of our repository. We're on options, the default tab, and we want to scroll all the way down to this part that says GitHub Pages. And so GitHub sometimes automatically does this for you if your branch is named GitHub Pages, but basically you just choose a branch that you want to use as the target. And so we're going to use GitHub Pages as the target because, again, GitHub Pages contains only our web files, whereas all these other branches contain code, and we can't actually deploy a website just using the code. And here are some other options, like you can add a custom domain. Like I said earlier, it might, change some of the other settings from earlier, like the public path, but it should be pretty straightforward. And now it tells us that our website is deployed or published at this URL. And so when we go to this URL, it's really just the website that I created. This is the very simple homepage, and we can, go to the different URLs and routes and see the different components that we've created in past videos. In the future, I'll make this look nicer and add like a navigation bar and everything, but for this video, I just wanted to show you guys how to deploy it to GitHub Pages. And so that's really it for this video. I know we touched on a lot of different subjects today, and so if you have any specific questions about any of the other topics that you want to dive deeper on, feel free to comment and ask me. Thanks everyone again for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.